It is definitely, as they call it, Disneyland, an e-ticket ride. When the motors start, there's 3 liquid-fueled engines. They start 6 seconds early, so they can be checked by computers. If they don't pass those checks, they'll be shut down and the mission will be aborted.
Primary control of all the vehicle's critical functions.
Assuming they are checked okay, you get this heavy vibration in the cockpit for 6 seconds as these things are coming on. And then at T0, there's hold-down bolts that are pyrotechnically blowing. The ignition of the solid rocket boosters occurs simultaneously, and the rocket leaps off the launch pad.
Booster ignition and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery, returning to the space station, paving the way for future missions beyond.
The vibrations increase as you're going supersonic. About 2 minutes up, though, the boosters burn out and separate. You hear a bang, you see a whip of fire across the windscreens as these boosters are blowing away, and then it's like a light switch, dead quiet, soundless. The only way you can tell you're moving, besides looking at your instruments, are the G-forces rising on your body, and those will ultimately stabilize. Obviously, becoming an astronaut, you would say, hey, I'm not going to change anything. I got there, and that was the process which led me there. I wish that I would have understood earlier in life how my potential, what I was capable of. When I was in high school, I was always comparing myself to others, thinking I didn't measure up. I was afraid of failure, afraid to ask a girl for a date, afraid I'd be rejected, afraid to participate or try out for sports, afraid I would fail, try out for student government, afraid I would fail. It was West Point that opened my eyes to what challenge and rising above that fear of failure means. I wish I would have learned that earlier in my life. And I tell kids that when I talk to kids is don't be afraid of failure. Well, I'll say it to adults too. Don't be afraid of failure. We learn from our failures, and we can apply those to future goal quests, and it might make all the difference to the lesson you learned the first time. Normalisation of deviance, that's a term, by the way. I didn't invent it. The first place I saw it was in Diane Vaughan's excellent book on the Challenger disaster called The Challenger Launch Decision. But basically what normalization of deviance is, it's very dangerous in hazardous environments. It's where people have established best practices, and teams, I think, are very good about this. They understand the environment they're operating in, whether it's firefighting, whether it's mining, whether it's manufacturing, flying airplanes. People understand the dangers associated with that, and they address those dangers before they ever do anything. They say, okay, how do we mitigate this danger? And they come up with checklists, with procedures that incorporate the best practices that will keep people safe. That's great. They then train people. That's great. But then in the execution phase, pressures start building, schedule pressures, and pressures that we all carry, like pressures associated with family, finances, health, things like that. We all go to work with these pressures on us. And under those pressures, we can be tempted to shortcut these best practices. Perhaps not wearing the right protective equipment, not doing a lockout, tagout, things like that. We feel pressured. It might be somebody looking at their watch and thinking, man, if I wrap this up, I can get a head start on holiday traffic. Oh, I can save some time here by not following that checklist. I know this. I can just cut to this point. I don't need to go through all these preparatory steps. So they take that shortcut. And many, many times when these first shortcuts are taken, the outcome is favorable. The person looking to save some time getting home take the kids to the football game, they do it successfully. It works. So what's going to happen the next time that person is under those same pressures? They have that experience of having gotten away with a shortcut in the past. They're going to be mightily tempted to do it again. And they get away with it enough times. This can be at an individual level or a collective team level. Once they get away with it a number of times, it becomes ever harder for them to realize that they are well deviant from the safety best practices. They're blind to it. It becomes normal to follow that deviant path. And again, another term I picked up in Diane Vaughan's book was predictable surprises. That when you start normalizing deviance, predictable surprises occur. Those can be injurious, and in hazardous environments, they can certainly be injurious, and they can certainly be fatal. But that is the process of normalization of deviance, this incremental creeping away from best practices until that deviance becomes normal for the individual or normal for the collective team. Usually, in the normalization of deviance process, and you can take Challenger as an example, the engineers who are working these problems really feel like they are doing it right, that the decisions they are making are in the best interest of the team, in the best interest of safety. But because it had been an incremental movement away from these best practices, they can't see, it's not clear to them how deviant they are. It's a very subtle thing. It's not just something that people blindly rush into. As I said, it victimizes us as humans. We get away with these shortcuts, the outcome is favorable, and another thing I tell people along this line is risk has no memory. Think about that. Risk has no memory. As humans, we don't think that. Really, when you think about it, when you start taking risky behavior and getting away with it, the next time you do it, you think, well, it's not so risky this time. Like you use a ladder unsafely at home, or you rush, you don't latch a seatbelt, or whatever it is. The next time you do these things, you think, well, the risk now is a little bit less because nothing bad happened the first time. And they think it diminishes each time. With the frequency of their success, the risk is being diminished. And it doesn't work that way. We all know that the risk remains the same. I tell people, you go to work, you could have had 20 years of complete safe operations. Have the risk changed? No, the risk remains the same. And we always need to address it like that. We can't fall victim to start taking shortcuts and believing that somehow the risk is lessened. It takes advantage of these, if you want, flaws in our humanity. That tomorrow is going to be just like yesterday, that risk is diminished, those type of things. Normalization of deviance occurs regardless of the environment you're operating in. As I tell people, the only difference between teams are the rewards of success and the consequences of failure. That's it. We all find our rewards the same way, following the right procedures, the best practices procedures, and we will all find our disasters the same way, and that is by normalizing deviance, taking shortcuts, those type of things. It's just that the outcome is different. In aviation and mining and construction, those outcomes can be very ugly. It can be fatal, fatalities. Whereas maybe at a bank or some other operation, nobody's life's endangered. The bottom line is affected. That's certainly the outcome that they would consider as a predictable surprise, perhaps, and their worst nightmare is a bottom line rather than a fatality. So it applies to everybody, this normalization of deviance process. In fact, a classic example is the global financial collapse, where the outcome obviously affected many, many people. I mean, nothing blew up, nothing exploded, but the tragedy, there was certainly a lot of individual tragedies associated with that global financial meltdown. And again, that was a case of long-term normalization of deviance. I've read books and articles about that, and it parallels very closely what you see with the Challenger disaster and a lot of other disasters where people are giving early warnings. If we continue to do this, it's going to end very, very ugly. But the schedule pressures are such, other political pressures, they can move people into continuing to do things, even though these warnings are floating around that it's going to end very, very badly. Well, when I talk about responsibility and accountability, I like to tell a story from my flying career. I won't go into all the details, but basically I was in a position on a mission where I should have spoken up about an action the pilot was taking. But I didn't, because I was basically my first flight in that plane. I didn't feel that I counted. I felt like the pilot had so much more flying time in the plane that he knew what he was doing. Any rate, fast forward here, we ultimately had to bail out of the plane. Almost got killed and came within a fraction of a second of getting killed, a very low altitude ejection. And I use that as a gateway to emphasize this point. At a critical moment in this team operation in a hazardous environment, I stopped being a team member and became a passenger. I just sat there because I didn't think I counted. And there are lessons to derive from this, one of which, when it comes to responsibility and accountability, is see something, say something, do something. I saw something, but that's where it ended. Didn't say anything, didn't do anything. And the reason we have to do this, and it goes back to what I said earlier, we're all in it together. And there's a case that my inaction, sitting there as a passenger, not voicing my opinion, my concerns, resulted in endangering me, certainly, but also endangering this pilot sitting next to me. And in hazardous operations, you got to get your head around this, folks, is that your actions, your words, your deeds, your inactions are affecting not just your own safety, but the safety of your teammates. And we've got to take each other's backs. I really like to emphasize this with people who are in particularly hazardous environments. You should be going out to those work sites, having a pre-brief, talking amongst yourselves how the job's going to be done, the procedures are there, everybody understands what they're going to do. Be situationally aware, looking around, making sure something hasn't changed in the environment to even bring more danger on you. Traffic, electrically energized lines, weights being lifted above you, weather's bad, night, whatever it is. But you're situationally aware, these pre-briefs, and everybody should be looking at everybody else and saying, take my back. If you see me doing something that's endangering me or others, say something. I'll take your back. Let's face it, when you have a large people in a hazardous operation, some of those people, because of the pressures they're under, maybe family pressures, they're not bringing their A game to that work. Maybe somebody's out there working. I've done this too. How many times have you gone to work, flying or something, and what are you thinking of? Man, I hope everything's okay with the kid in the hospital appointment that they have today. That's in the back of your brain. Or maybe you're going through a serious relationship issue. That's in the back of your brain. So you're not bringing your A game to this hazardous operation. And that's why if everybody collectively is watching out for everybody, you can all go home safely. There's an expression once one of the pilots, astronaut pilots, said, and I thought it was pretty good. We were talking about the risk associated with the space shuttle. And how far do you go to eliminate risk before you commit to flying? And he said the only way we're ever going to have a completely safe space shuttle is to stripe it red and black, or stripe it yellow and black, like a dangerous object, and park it out in front of a museum somewhere. That's the only way it's going to ever be safe. In other words, you don't fly it if you want to be completely safe. Every time that shuttle launched, there was risk associated with it. But we had this marvelous team that was trying to mitigate those risks as best as possible. Through how? Well, through redundancy. In a failure modes and effects analysis document, each component is looked at and addressed. Okay, if this fails, what's going to happen? Now, what procedures, what processes, what redundancy is put in place to protect you from that failure? And at some point, you have to say, this is good enough. I mean, if you want to, you could say, well, hold it, if all 4 of these things fail, you're going to have a tragedy. Yeah, well, that's why we're putting 4 of these things in place, this redundancy, or adding to the strength of some structure more than we think it needs. We're doing that to mitigate those risks. So the risks are always going to be there. In soft or operations where life and limb are not at risk, to very dangerous operations. But if people will sit down, and look at the risk and address them and ensure the best practices are incorporated in those procedures, and not just look within their own industry or their own companies, but in the industry in which they're operating. They should be going out there and asking, what else has happened out there in this industry, in this mining industry, in this refining industry, in this manufacturing industry? What other near misses and disasters have occurred? Let's make sure we're aware of those so we don't have to relearn something at great expense in life and limb that's something that's already been learned in the past. So let's make sure we capitalize on all the information out there, and let's make it dynamic. Don't just one time sit down and address these risks, but periodically go back and say, okay, what are these in fact the best practices? Have we learned something? Should these practices be modified? There should be no hesitation of modifying a procedure to incorporate a better awareness of some risks. That's completely, in fact, it's a requirement. As I was just talking with the Refining New Zealand, and one of the gentlemen there said, hey, we're going to do it in the light of day. If we change procedures, we're going to do it in the light of day. We're going to have everybody on board, make sure it's the right procedures, and we're going to mitigate this risk as best as possible. And I think that's all the way it should be done. You don't shoot from the hip and say, we're going to change the procedures. No, you do it with the right committee, the right people on board, make sure you're doing it right, but it should be a living, breathing thing, and not just something you do once and set on a shelf and think it's going to be the same 20 years later. Well, my definition of self-leadership is the ability to change ourselves, to basically stand out of ourselves, turn around, and ask the question to your new self: is that the guy that really is safe as possibly can be? And if not, how can that person change? And basically, how can I change? As I tell my audiences, if I stand up there and pass on some of these messages, other safety people stand up there and pass on those safety messages, and each time you walk out unchanged, then clearly it's a waste of time. So we have to have the ability to motivate ourselves out of comfort zones, challenge ourselves to apply these lessons that we hear, to change ourselves and be safer. That's what my definition of self-leadership is. And the reason it's so critical is that if we don't continually challenge ourselves, and this is particularly important for people who have had stellar safety records, you can move to a comfort zone where you're thinking to yourself, well, for all these years, decades maybe, we've been so safe, we're there. This is it. This is as good as it's ever going to get. And the analogy I use, it's like a player crossing the goal line, spiking the ball, say, game over, I won. Now, I will say do that in the sense of celebrating your success, but remember, risk has no memory. So that it doesn't matter how successful you've been in the past. Each day in a hazardous environment is a new day. Those risks are identical to what they were yesterday. And so that's why we have to say we've got to redouble our efforts to stay safe. And how can we do that? Listen to other people, archiving the information that we have and periodically reviewing it. Look outside of our company to the other places within the industry that we're in, and see what other lessons can be learned there. But it's a constant movement toward self-improvement, of challenging ourselves, changing ourselves, and collectively changing as a team so we can be safe and then maintain that safety. I mean, celebrate your successes, but remember they have to be maintained. You can't expect that just because there's a history of success that it's going to continue. Again, as victims, we fall for that old, our tomorrows are going to be just like our yesterdays, and that's very dangerous when it comes to safety. Let me just review for you, capture what I've been talking about here. Make sure you guard yourself and your teams against this very dangerous phenomena of incremental shortcutting, normalization of deviance, incremental shortcutting of best practices until that becomes the team's normal or you individually your normal. Incorporate those procedures I mentioned about protecting yourself from that, by following procedures, making sure procedures incorporate the best safety best practices and religiously following those. Remember that risk has no memory, so every day approach your job in hazardous environments as if it's the first time you've ever done that job, and do it every day that way. Remember that past success doesn't guarantee future success. Again, we're very prone to believing that. These are the type of things that can protect you from this normalization of deviance process, and from the responsibility, accountability. Never lose sight of where you are in the greater team. And we can do that, particularly on large teams, thinking, this team has 1,000 people on it. How can I possibly matter? Well, you do matter. You're unique. None of those other 999 people are you. You bring a different perspective to the table, and you might be seeing something related to safety that nobody else is seeing. So make sure you understand that. You count, see something, say something, do something. We're all in it together. We're all weaving this tapestry of safety culture in our attitudes and our actions, what we say, what we don't say. Never lose sight of that. You really do count for this greater team. And then finally, let's make sure that we have this attitude, practice this attitude of courageous self-leadership, of stepping out of ourselves, turning around, and challenging ourselves to change, to be better, to be safer. And if you can do those things, folks, I think it would help you be safer out there in these very hazardous environments that some of you operate in.